we started.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure and my honor to welcome you today at a very special edition of the international reunions we organize under the auspices of the Familia international magazine in Romania. It is an edition dedicated to the translation and the publication of one of the masterpieces of the Romanian classic literature, The Wrecks of the Old Cart, in America at the Northwestern University Press under the translation of our special guest this evening, Mr. Sean Cotter. Welcome here, Mr. Cotter. The initiative of this special edition belongs to a great Romanian contemporary writer and a very active promoter of the Romanian culture abroad, Mr. Bogdan Suceava. We would like very much to thank him for this initiative and for being here with us and for organizing this special edition. Welcome, Bogdan. And I would also like to introduce to all of you and to the ones which eventually don't know him, the coordinator of all those programs and the editor-in-chief of the prestigious Familia International cultural magazine, Mircea Pricojan, thanks to which all those programs can take place. Thank you very much. Welcome once again, everybody. And I would like now to leave the floor for Bogdan Suceava, who is the main artisan and the coordinator of this edition of the international reunions. Bogdan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mircea. I really appreciate it. So it's my pleasure to invite Mircea Pricojan to address first our guest.
Hello. Glad to see you. Glad to meet you until we meet in person. I have the greatest pleasure to present with this occasion two diplomas. On behalf of the Revista Familia of Familia magazine, I'm very happy to present Mr. Sean Cotter this diploma of honor in recognition of his outstanding work in translating and promoting to the international academic community some of the most important literary works in Romanian culture, including Matei Caragiale's stellar novel Breaks of the Old Court and Nikita Stănescu's poetry. This is the diploma. I'm very happy to be able to present it today.
This is a great surprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the other one goes to Northwestern University Press, the one that published so many works in translation, Romanian literary works in translation. And this is also a diploma of honor in recognition, I'm just reading the text, in recognition of their outstanding work in publishing and promoting some of the most important literary works in Romanian culture to the international academic community, including Matei Caragiale and Gelu Naums. So this goes to Northwestern University Press. On behalf of Familia Cultural Magazine, we are very grateful for the work you are doing in promoting Romanian literature and culture. Thank you so much. And
thank you very much for this honor. I always say that I've benefited much more than I can ever describe from my encounters with Romanian literature and Romanian culture, and my dear friends that are in this field with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Mircea. So now I have the distinct honor to actually introduce participants in this panel, and let me start by introducing Crina Bud, who's teaching Romanian language and culture with Grandon College at York University in Toronto. Crina is the author of over 100 studies and papers. What is most interesting is that, if I recall correctly, her postdoctoral research theme was focused on capitalizing on cultural identities among global processes. So thank you, Crina, for joining us tonight. Then let me welcome Luminița Corneanu, who's a literary critic and historian, most notably author of the volume Leonid Dimov, an oniric in the Power of Babel, a book that was awarded and nominated for most important Romania Literary Awards 6 years ago. Then it's my pleasure to welcome Alex Goldish, who's a faculty with the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj. He's a co-founder, together with Mihaela Ursa, 6 years ago, of the high-impact Metacritic Journal for Comparative Studies and Theory. And among his many works, I could mention here, I would like to cite two: the essays Between Transnationalism and Nation Building, Literary History of Geolocation, which was a chapter in the volume Romanian Literature as World Literature, published with Bloomsbury Academic 3 years ago. And in the same year, 2018, Literary Interferences in Subversive East European Cultures, published in a volume edited at Peter Lang. So welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Doru Pop, who's a professor at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj, who's the author of 3 volumes dedicated to Romanian movies. In 2014, it was Romanian New Wave Cinema, an introduction with McFarland. Then in 2018, the volume The Age of Promiscuity, Narrative and Mythological Mutations in Contemporary Cinema and Popular Culture, with Lexington Books. And forthcoming in November with Bloomsbury Romanian Cinema, Thinking Outside the Screen. And last but not least, I'm a great fan of the novel A Socialist Soap Opera, published a decade ago. Oh, it was like yesterday. So thank you very much, Doru, for joining us. That being said, my pleasure to invite Luminița Corneanu to an introduction to the heritage of Caragiale's family, please.
Thank you. Well, actually, I thought about this the moment you invited me to this this talk, and thank you for this. When I asked you, will it be in Romanian, will it be for the Romanian public, and you said no, and then I thought, oh my God, what would a foreign audience understand of this without knowing what Caragiale means in Romanian culture, in Romanian literature. And I thought it would be important to start with this. The father, Ioan Luca, who is our probably most important playwright. And I think that even today, if we go out in the street and ask 100 Romanians about Caragiale, and 99 out of them will think of the father of Ioan Luca and not Matei. And that is not to diminish Matei, it's just to try and show how famous Ioan Luca is. And I think that he is still so important because his plays especially, but also his prose, are still very relevant to us. And I think it would be funny for at least some of you who don't know this to hear about it. As some of you may know, in today's Romania, one of the governing parties have elections for that president. And there is quite a harsh competition there. And last week, I have read a headline in a newspaper saying the Liberal Party needs a Dandanache solution. Dandanache, as we all know, is a character from one of Ioan Luca's plays. And the Dandanache solution, a Romanian doesn't need a translation for that, is a third and worse solution. Is how you calm everybody down, because nobody can be against Dandanache, he bothers nobody. The thing is that Ioan Luca Caragiale was almost as big and as famous in life as he is after his death. And what some foreign readers should know about Matei Caragiale is that he grew with his very famous father. His father was a very important journalist, a very well-known playwright. He was the director, the manager of the National Theatre in Bucharest. He was what we would call today a political commentator of the moment. And his huge father has ambitions and plans for the son, to which the son didn't agree. More than that, Matei Caragiale was the illegitimate son of this father. And he, at the age of 4 or 5, he was brought to the new family of his father, taken away from his mother to be raised in this new family. And all these things were very important to him. He actually, it looks like he never made peace with his situation as an illegitimate child, and it led to an inferiority complex. A Romanian literary critic actually called this the compensatory dream of nobiliary ancestry, because Matei Caragiale invented for himself this nobiliary ancestry. And also, even in the book that we will discuss today, we can see glimpses of this problematic relationship between the two of them, like the father who deprives his son from an important inheritance because the son doesn't obey the father. The father who writes boring letters. These fathers are his father, and I think that this is an important perspective. Two literary historians wrote recently that Matei Caragiale is anti-Caragiale. And I think that this is a thing that we should know when we talk about Matei Caragiale.
Thank you very much, Luminița, for this introduction. And now it's my great pleasure to invite Shan to read the first fragment. Not before mentioning that how the format is gonna work. So first, we're gonna have altogether 2 fragments that Shan will read. And after each fragment, we're gonna take a look at the text. We're gonna ask him questions, and we're gonna let the discussion flow as freely as possible. So feel free after the fragment to step in and actually address any idea related to the book that you might feel like it's that belongs here. Without much further ado, Shan, please, the first fragment, which I think is the introduction, right?
Yes, I was going to read the first. It takes about 4 minutes, but it goes from the beginning of the book to what is, I think, the most famous passage of the book, this description of a waltz that they encounter. The only passage, as you know, that Matei repeats almost word for word at the end of the book as well. So we'll get the beginning and the end, in effect, with this passage. So, Rake's Congress. Even though I'd sworn an oath the previous evening to myself to return early, I arrived home even later than usual, the next day toward noon. Evening found me horizontal, having lost all sense of time. I would have stayed fast asleep were it not for a letter that arrived with a ruckus, begging a signature. When my sleep is disturbed, I am groggy, inconversible, costive. I refuse to sign. I moaned that I should be left alone. I dozed again for a moment. The blasted epistle again materialized, now accompanied by raw lamplight. The villainous postman had deemed it meet to sign for me with his own hand. I showed no gratitude. I loathe letters. As long as I have lived, I cannot say I have received more than one from my good friend Uri. that brought me happy news. I have a fear of letters. In those days, I would burn them without opening. This fate awaited the newly arrived. Recognizing the hand, I could guess the message. I knew it by heart. That saltless, home-cooked fish bake of counsel and hounding, served up the first of each month. The counsel to set myself on some career like a man, the nagging to reform myself. And in closing, the never absent wish that God would keep his watch over me. Amen. In the mood I found myself, it would have been beyond my power to set on any path at all. I could not even move in my bed. My joints dismantled, my lower back in agony. I felt like stewed pig. Into my fogged mind came the fear I was suffering some palsy. But I was not, and in the end I overcame my state. For a month, without a word or murmur, with hope and motive, I had been going out for some drinks, some rakery, some play. In the years previous, I had been sorely tried by my circumstances, my tiny raft battered by great waves. I defended myself ineptly, and disgusted with everything beyond measure, I strove to find, within a life of debauchery, oblivion. I took things a little quickly, however, and soon saw myself forced to lay down arms. I was completely trained. That evening, I felt finished, such that I could not imagine moving were the house to take flame. But I found myself suddenly in the middle of my room, on my feet, looking anxiously at the clock. I had remembered I was invited to eat with Pantazi. What luck I had awoken, what great luck. I was grateful now for my parents' letter. Without it, I would have missed the date with my dearest friend. I dressed and went out, a night toward winter, an air of tears. Even though there had been no rain, everything was wet. The gutters wept, the branches stripped of leaves, dripped fat drops, running down trunks and window grills like a cold sweat. This was the season that drove one, above all, to the bottle. The few passers-by who drizzled through the fog were almost all drunk. One gangly boy, descending the steps of the bar, fell to the ground in a heap and did not move again. I turned my head in disgust. Since the establishment selected for this evening sat on Strada Kovac, I took a hansom. It proved to be the right choice, since on my arrival, the guests were already on their second round of Tswika, and he who guested us his third. I was surprised everyone had materialized so early. Pantazi explained that he had come straight from home, while Pashadia and Pirgu from their club, the weather being too foul to dawdle over aperitifs. Pantazi pronounced another round of Tswika, but the good cheer we wished each other, glasses clinking, was nowhere apparent. I feared I would fall asleep again. In the hall, where a grotesque banquet of merchants and traders began to warm up, it was Saturday night. Our table felt more like a wake. The borscht, garnished with cream and a hot pepper, was sipped in silence. None of those sharing table raised their eyes from their bowls. Pirgu especially seems to suffer a dark humor. I would have started conversation if the musician had not begun precisely that waltz for which Pantazi had a weakness, a slow, dragging waltz, voluptuous and sad, almost funereal. In its malicious oscillation, it traced a nostalgic and endlessly somber passion, one so rending that the very pleasure of listening to it became a kind of suffering. When the taut violin strings began to mimic a careworn confession, the entire hall, in profound enchantment, fell mute. Ever darker, lower, and slower, describing dolor and deception, wandering and pain, rue and regret, the song, suffocated in nostalgia, drifted away, withered into a whisper, to a lost, tardy, and pointless cry. Pantazi wiped his eyes.
Thank you very much. So this is the first reading, the first piece of reading, and I would like to invite us all to step in with questions, comments, anything related to the book, to this fragment, anything, please. Just unmute and step in.
So please, I would like our honored guests to address questions to the translator?
Sean, I would like to start with a puzzle. And first, I want to thank you for trying to translate my own novel, which is in a way indebted to Matei Caragiale and his language, and his style. And it has to do with the difficulty of translating Romanian into English, because my deep belief as a speaker, native speaker of Romanian, of course, and a decent speaker of English, is that they are very incompatible. They are miles apart. And so, without much ado, why did you choose the term rakes for cry? Because cry is such a complex word in Romanian, and in the stylistics of Matei, it plays a tremendous role throughout the book. The notion of cry is very complex, and if we will have time, I will go back with my own contribution with the cinematic discussion about the cinematic version of the book, because in the 90s, Mircea Veroiu has made a cinematic version of the book, and maybe we'll have time to discuss about that. But Sean, please address this issue, because I have not a problem. I like the term. I so much loved your translation, but I'm really curious. Why did you choose rakes for cry?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for your appreciation. And I am anxious to talk about the film, which I watched many times while working on the translation. And my hope is that at some points in the dialogue, you can hear the actors speaking through my English as well. But about rakes, you're right that this is one of the central translation problems of the text. And I've actually dedicated 2 footnotes to this question in this edition. The salient point for me in the bit of description that I gave is the idea that this this formulation, rakes of the old court, is possibly my keystone rather than simply the word rakes itself. That really what we're talking about is this ironic use of cry in the formula of rakes of the old cry de corte vecche to refer to those let's call them cuckoo inhabitants of the old court that moved into the court once it had been abandoned during the in the 18th century. These were the dregs of society. So they were only in the sense kind of kings in that sense, in the most ironic possibility. These were actually thieves and marauders and people who were squatting in the building itself and were only driven out later by force. And so the term for me, I didn't want to try to capture the sense of nobility in the first place. What I was looking for was this sense of this ironic formulation. So there had to be some kind of tension in between the first term and the description of the old court in English. Obviously, although I do include this history in the footnote, English language readers are not going to understand that tension right away. And so if I were to have chosen something like Kings of the Old Court, that might have not given the sense of irony. And there are, the Spanish translation calls them the depraved princes of the old court. The German translation simply calls them the four of the old court, and it avoids this question entirely and just counts them, which I don't think is a satisfactory solution. The term rakes goes back to 18th century poetry and Alexander Pope, who is describing these kind of libertines, these wealthy but low-level nobles in English society who were famous for their debaucherous lives. And so that seemed to me to be the direction we wanted to go. There's actually a sequence of paintings by Hogarth, a sequence of engravings by Hogarth, where they're called the Rake's Progress. And in this, you see him go from his kind of elegant and respectable beginnings, all the way through a night of debauchery and brothels and so it's also important within the history of English literature that we go back to an antiquated word that has, I think, some, if not all, of the proper associations for the characters we're talking about.
I was absolutely sure that there is something about the various layers in time of the English language, and this is something that I would personally never know. There's like centuries of history of semantics. And one we have to go perhaps about the 19th century to recapture something that's related to Matei's style, because he's coming from there. Even if he writes at the beginning of the 20th century, I think that's about the right age.
Mm-hmm. I saw Karina.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to address your question, but I think I already received an answer. For that question, but I would like to start by saying that I'm really happy to be here with you this evening, and I want to tell you that I read your book, Literary Translation and the Idea of a Minor Romania, not only once, and I asked my Canadian students to do to do so. So now it's really a pleasure to meet you as a translator. And I would like to thank you really for this opportunity, for the challenge, if you have, of rethinking, reimagining Mateu Caragiale's universe from an American English perspective. And nonetheless, for the chance of very close reading of his writing, and I want to say, maybe you can start to think about an audiobook. It was so great to hear your reading, and as a Romanian speaker and reader, I think all of us, the majority of us, we are reading Matei's texts as a kind of spell, maybe, or a kind of incantation, enchantment. Why? Because, there were, and maybe there still are, people able to recite Matei's texts, or Matei's novel, all of it. I want to underline that. And that's because, I don't know, the sonorities prevail over meanings sometimes, or because, I don't know, atmosphere and landscapes, amoral landscapes, are maybe more important than the plot. That's why maybe the Romanian audiobook was a success, a real success. That's why maybe these books had great illustrations, and not only one. And maybe that's why we have a movie. So that's really interesting from that point of view. But what I want to ask you is really, when we read a translation, and especially your translation, every word is important. Suddenly we have to pay attention to every term, to every word. Every neighborhood of a word is revealing. It's important because we are following your thinking, your work, and it's really important. And that's kind of your search, your findings are teasing our certainties and and of course it's how to say, revitalizing our hesitations about this kind of literature. And now my question, I read an interview that you gave some time ago, and you spoke there about a kind of model for your work as a translator. And you spoke about Joyce's method of tunneling. And my question is coming to another connection with Joyce. It's a connection underlined by Matei Călinescu. Matei Călinescu said that, or he thought that Mateu Caragiale deserves a dictionary of his own writing. And something similar to, I don't know, Ulysses Annotated or annotations to Finnegan's Wake or something like that. And my question was, could you give us a word or an expression? Maybe the title of the book is already there. Yeah, you already spoke about that. But can you give us, a word, a term, something, an expression for that kind of dictionary? Something to express Mateu's, I don't know, style or, ethos, something like that.
Yeah, I think that you're, thank you, by the way, for your attention to my other works and to even these, my fleeting interviews. I think the connection with modernism is actually very significant. Obviously, the heritage of modernism is slightly different, that Joyce didn't grow up reading Matei, and not vice versa. So we're not talking about direct influence in that sense. But we are talking about a similarity of perspective that both of these authors, and Joyce and Pound and T.S. Eliot, all of this group of modernists are antiquarians. That all of them are interested in bringing the past into the awareness of the present. That is to say, it's always there, but you're going to be, Leopold Bloom is not just a character walking through Dublin, but he is the presence of ancient Greece. He is the presence of Odysseus within our contemporary context. And to this end, I was looking at the modernists' work on translation. So Anglophone modernists work on translation. You might know that there's this famous division from the 1970s by Frank Kermode, who divides modernists, Anglophone modernists into neo-modernists. And here we have people like Stein or Dada would definitely be that kind of neo-modernism, and the paleo-modernists, who are those that go backwards, these antiquarian modernists. And as I've already mentioned, Eliot, Pound, and H.D. is also in this category, and several others. So what I looked at when I was looking at those modernists in terms of finding a model for the translation, in part was the kind of the simple mundane sense that I've studied the drafts of Finnegan's Wake that have been all published in a very impressive edition by the University of Buffalo. And there you can see Joyce working out a passage and then going back and revising it with more and more layers of linguistic meaning being added to it, and until it's overloaded. But you can see through the process of crossing out passages and inserting passages and changing words from one language to another language, literally, right, from going to gang. You can see Joyce infusing his text with more and more meaning until it is ready to explode or topple over. And I followed some of that same process in translating, that I would translate, well, it is kind of misleadingly called a literal version or a mot a mot, word for word version. And then I would go back and I would revise with an eye towards increasing the linguistic depth of the English. Revise and revise and revise and revise. But the other thing that I learned from the modernists was their interest in a particular series of translations that were republished during the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. These are called the Tudor translations. And this is this huge enterprise of translation that took place during the Tudor period in English. The King James Bible is only the most famous of a whole production of translations that gave us things like the plots for Shakespeare's plays. And these paleo-modernists were interested in particular in all these translation projects. T.S. Eliot writes an introduction to the translations of Seneca from this time. And what they're looking at there is linguistic tension. It's a key thing that Eliot wants to pay attention to. And so I learned from reading the modernists on translation how to translate by incorporating linguistic tension, the tension of old words and new words, the tension of Germanic words and Latinate words within English. All of that was my my guiding principle as I was working on the translation. So I think that's kind of a long explanation for what modernism is doing in the translation. As for a dictionary, we could think about giving a dictionary to a literary work, or we could do what the critic Hugh Kenner says, and that is to read the Oxford English Dictionary as a kind of a poem. And this is, in fact, how I read this dictionary. This dictionary was incredibly important to me in my work on this translation. So Kenner makes the argument that the Oxford English Dictionary is the epic poem of the 19th century. And so I think that's the kind of literary sequence for this. And now that I mentioned that, I think it's Șerban Cioculescu that has a dictionary, actually a fairly ample dictionary of Mateisms. That was important to me. In the passage we just read, he was the one that explained to me that dictionary was and I can't remember the exact words, but the change in meaning of musafir from host to guest that happens in Romanian was explained to me in that dictionary that Cioculescu put together. And so I was able to find in English that one can guest somebody in the sense of hosting them, that you make them a guest. And so that I use that in this passage that I've read already when the narrator arrives at the club, and sorry, not the club, at the restaurant, and he finds that the guests were on their second round of suica, and he who guested us his third. So I did use that dictionary in that translation. So I covered several points there, but I'm hoping all of them are interesting.
Well, thank you,
Some
Karina.
other questions for our special guest, Mr. Cotter?
No, Mircea, I know very well what you mean, because I know for sure that you have a few questions. Go ahead, please. You're most welcome. You're anxious. I know. Please.
Well, I want to invite someone else, but if you insist, okay. Thank you. I would like to ask you whether in closing your the vocabulary of Mateu Caragiale to the American writer, to the American readers, just as you made in the case of the title, you used a term, you used actually an idiomatic expression specific to another layer, to another time layer of the English. Whether you did so also with those very specific, sometimes regional, sometimes historical terms in Mateu Caragiale's book. That means whether you choose this variant of searching for specific words in older layers of the English language, or by contrary, if you tried to get that Mateus language closer to the modern English language. So did you try to find equivalents in the older English, or to approach his speech towards the contemporary language, towards the contemporary speak?
So the principle that I've followed, I mean, the answer is actually very simple: older speech. In facing a choice, if I had the option of choosing between those two, I was choosing older forms of English. And in that sense, I used the historical thesaurus of the English language, that is a side project of the Oxford English Dictionary. At first, I didn't have access to this, but about 2 years into working on the project, I did gain electronic access to this historical thesaurus, which is amazing. Which is, you look up tavern and you suddenly have 20 examples arranged by year of different possibilities in English for the word tavern. I won't promise, or I won't claim that I've gotten this on a word-for-word basis, because it's simply not possible to translate words. Translators, in my opinion, don't work on words. They work on, at best, sentences, probably paragraphs, most likely chapters, sometimes books, sometimes the life around the book, sometimes the critical heritage around the book. Sometimes they translate all of particular literature. Sometimes they translate all of literature itself when they translate at any particular moment of the translation. And then really what I'm going for is not to be locally faithful at every moment, faithful to the particular contours of this word. I have to know that as best I can, the particular contours of that word. But it's not always possible to find an equivalent at that spot. And so if I am locally unfaithful, I am globally faithful. And that was my guiding principle in this, is that if I can't do it there, I will do it someplace else. And so there's several words. So Sergenuit is my favorite example, because it was my favorite because it was one of the moments where I felt like in the process of working on the translation, I felt like I was beginning to find my way. So Pasha Dia is described as being Sergenuit, sent to a different country for his education. And he's not exilat, right? He's not, or trimis, he's Sergenuit. This, of course, is a word that has a Turkish etymology to it. And we don't have a great storehouse of Turkish etymologies in English. I asked a friend of mine, Aron Aji, who's a great Turkish to English translator, how he gets Turkishness into English. And he told me, Sean, you can only say yogurt so many times. So that gave me permission to look beyond that kind of simplistic idea of finding Turkish things in English. And so when I was faced with the problem of Sergenuit, I started looking back through the historical layers of English. And I could have used exiled, but as I went further back, I found one of these words from the Tudor period, which was exputed. So kind of spit out, right? That's the same origin as spit out, but exputed is a word we don't use. I've never been exputed from a bus while going downtown, right? But I used it there. I was able to use exputed. So Pasha Dia is exputed from one country to another. So the origin there is Latin, and I'm using that origin, that Latinate word, aggressively Latinate word, ridiculously kind of carnivalesque Latinate word, as a equivalent for a word that has a Turkish etymology in Romanian. In fact, Latin would take us more closely towards the core of Romanian, the Romance language of it. So in those terms, it should be the opposite of what I wanted. But actually in English, in a global sense, if even it's locally unfaithful to the Turkish, it is globally faithful to Mate's style. So that's how I approach those questions.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So please, Luminita, any remarks, questions?
Yes, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Good evening to everybody. I'm very honored to be here with you tonight, and I'm very glad that we have this translation of a very difficult novel, Matei Caragiale's novel. And I must say I am very glad to have this translation, because we've lived in the past decades in a culture where we thought that, literary critics of the 60s, of the 70s, often said that our major national writers are untranslatable. Their works are so important that they cannot be translated in other languages. So this was some kind of epitome of an inferiority complex in the Romanian culture, and I think that every proof that these difficult indeed writers are translatable start to dismantle this perspective, this slight protochronist perspective. I mean, we face the paradox that Shakespeare, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and others, as Sartre, were translatable, but not Creangă, Eminescu, or other writers. So I'm glad we are off this paradigm. I'm very interested. Because I've also read, and I was impressed, just like Rina, by your book on literary translation and the idea of a minor Romania. And I think that actually the main idea of the text was taken and has been put into circulation by more recent theories like James Brian Baer. This idea that in so-called peripheral or semi-peripheral cultures, the role of translation within national systems is privileged in a sense. I was wondering though whether your meta reflection when you translated this book, because it is obvious from your insights that you tend to theorize the practice of translation, whether you were concerned about the afterlife of this book in the target culture. Did you try when you translated it to inscribe it into an American tradition, or to find a slight ideological context or aesthetic context into which this book can be embedded, so to say, and that could raise the impact of this book on, I don't know if there will be an impact on the larger public, but on the scholar society, on the academic field. So, did you think about the frameworks that could receive this book into the American culture or literary context, or did you just try to preserve its uniqueness, its exoticism, and so
on? So it's definitely one of the things I was thinking about as I'm working on the book. Of course, it's the process of translation, like the process of criticism, like the process of creation. These are all such variegated processes that it's difficult to pinpoint one essential feature of them. There's 2 points that I'd bring up in answer to your question. One is to say that in literary terms, we are living through a huge translation movement that has, in broad strokes, has elevated the presence of translation within the United States from where it was in the 1990s, where it was fairly terrible, to now where it's simply miserable. We're also seeing more interest in translation. We're seeing interest in particular in a wave of translations from modernist authors, especially from European modernist authors. Why? Because the copyright is out. And so these works have become much more easier to publish from a financial point of view. Right? And this was definitely true for me when working on Mate, that there was the book was initially rejected fairly fiercely by a number of editors, but then once the translation copyright expired, it gained some more attention. So it takes its place among other works like that are coming forward through the works of Wave Books or Wakefield, or Twisted Spoon is another small publisher that's working on this. But there are many of these where this book would find a home. But closer to my own interests is the idea of global modernisms, that there's a movement within modernist studies to look beyond Anglophone modernism or Francophone modernism to see other places, in particular languages of smaller circulation. Romanian is not the smallest of languages, but it does count as a smaller language in comparison with English and French. Look for other places where we have moments of modernism that have been underappreciated or otherwise neglected by the critical tools that we've developed for Anglophone modernism. In that respect, the idea of comparison becomes very important. The central thrust of global modernisms is to not reduce one modernism to another. So we're really not centrally interested in the fact that Tristan Tzara became important in France. That is not really that is a way of kind of expanding the zone of modernism to include other places, but it doesn't fundamentally change the way we think about modernism. If we were to think about Lucian Blaga or Arghezi in these terms, we'd find it much more difficult to assimilate them into our Anglophone modernist terms, and that is the productive point. And so the practice of comparison in which we maintain the identities of the parties that we're comparing is the central thrust of global modernism. That is very important for my translation because I see translation not as a reproduction of the work, but as the creation of a work that is interesting to compare to the original work. And so in that sense, we are right now the ideal audience that I imagine for this work, because all of you are fluent in both languages and can appreciate the kind of productive dissonance that happens. I think on the whole, for example, my English text is, while it attempts to reproduce and attempts to kind of mimic certain features of the original, is in the end fundamentally different from the original and in productive and interesting ways. So I think, for example, it's not quite as dirty. It's not quite the street vocabulary is a little bit less pronounced than in the original, despite the fact that I actually worked very intensely on those passages, especially with Bogdan, shouting terrible, terrible things over the telephone in my office at school. So despite all my best interests, there is a kind of basic difference between them. And of course, as I've already been suggesting, my translation delves into modernism from 100 years ago, Anglophone modernism from 100 years ago, English from 400 years ago. So this is the roots go that direction, whereas Mate takes our roots back to Ottoman vocabulary, it takes our roots to Greek vocabulary, it takes our roots to all of the languages that are mixed together in the etymologies of Romanian. So we can't equate these two things in the sense that a more naive version of translation theory would ask us to do. We have to compare them in a way that preserves their mutual identities. And so that is the scholarly context that I see for my translation. And in fact, it's not just that this would be a good book for modernists to work on, but actually comparative global modernisms is the theory of translation, provides the theory of translation that I'm using as I'm working.
Thank you.
Please, any other comments or remarks on the first part or anything related to everything that we said here?
Maybe I would like to add, maybe we should still believe that the medium is the message. Maybe the fact that Northwestern Press published this translation, it's meaningful, maybe, I assume so, because I saw that this publisher is promoting world and continental literature, and how to say, they take the courage to publish works of scholarship in horrible dictu humanities and social sciences. And I saw also they published a lot of great translations that received really awards, and it's really important, the quality of translation, what kind of translation you offer them, maybe. But I saw also that there are other, among the others published by Northwestern Press, there are also Gabriela Damestanu, there is Norman Mania. There is a great writer named Bogdan Suceava. I would like to ask you that Mateu Caragiale's book adds what to the image of I don't know, Romanian literature, or what's, and maybe you I don't know, you can give us a reason why this novel deserves the attention of an American publisher and of course of an American reader. You said, of course, you said already a lot of things about modernism.
Yeah, well, I mean, in part, I think that's enough. That if it's interesting, if we are still interested in modernism, and I think we fundamentally are. I think we're fundamentally still in a similar situation to we can call kind of a long modernism. Then I think that Monte is interesting for that reason. And I mean, my own personal interest in this is directed back towards Romanian. That my own passion for translation is a passion for creating texts that are in a kind of creative dissonance with the Romanian texts. And so that's and so you, my dear colleagues, are my best collaborators or my best audience for this type of work, and not the general English language public. But I hope that they read it. I think that what Mate is offering is a much more complicated experience of decadence, which is still a theme that's important to us, and of linguistic diversity. That he's offering an image of trying to build an idea of a nation on an idea of failure. It's a nostalgia with no past to be nostalgic for. And so there's kind of a contradictory nostalgia within the work. And it's that sense of the kind of the nation growing up, the nation kind of coming into national status without having gone through what he imagines France went through, what he imagines England went through, right? What he imagines that there would be some kind of foundation for the forms, as we're used to thinking of. The fact that he's trying to work out an idea, this kind of contradictory idea of nostalgia and contradictory idea of the nation, is, I think, something that's still interesting for readers of the book in English. That they would also, we can still understand many of the kind of the essential modernist paradoxes that activate our life today. I could give you my list of things that make our moment today modernist, but I think that we get at a lot of that by thinking of these tensions and paradoxes around character and cultural diversity that we see in Mate's texts.
I could bring up, there is also a definition of mathematical modernism due to Jeremy Gray. I think we should speak for about 4 hours just to discuss if there is any analog. I mean, the term is so complex and so intense, and there are so many analogies we can think of and we can infer. But about what you said right now, I was thinking, this is the Everest of translation from Romanian. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, there are not so many texts in Romanian literature that could have been so difficult in translation. And I'm wondering, all those people who are thinking that, in a few decades, maybe the translation softwares will be better and they will take over. And let me just say that nope. And here is the proof. We still need humans to do the work. And I'm just going to read 2 lines. I'm just going to prove right here, and I apologize if I'm going to butcher it, but anyways, this is absolutely beautiful. So this is Matei Caragiale's Wishan's voice. This is the dream scene on the last pages. The dream when the two of the characters are still there, but they dream of the third. In an old court, in the chapel of evil passions, the three rakes, great abbots of the most serene rank, celebrated their final service of Vespers, silent Vespers, Vespers of the beyond. Okay, so may I invite Shan to read the second part that he prepared for us, and thank you very much for this amazing work. It's absolutely unbelievable. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is a little bit shorter. This is a section of the sequence about Pantazi's passion for Wanda, and I chose this to go along with the opening passage because I'm following Cosmin Chodlo's reading of this as that original waltz was a waltz entitled Wanda, and that's why Pantazi is crying at the beginning of the book. I needed some time to recover. I hardly left the house. I began to take late walks far outside the city. In the course of these walks, I noticed that when I crossed the Marmizon Bridge, I always saw one unusually beautiful girl. I shortly became apprehensive of missing her, and I was sad when I did. Without my noticing, the hap of seeing her had developed into a need, and more emotions accumulated. Day or night, her face arose before my mind. I could not think of the young woman without becoming disturbed, and when I encountered her, I was overwhelmed with a timidity I had not known before, one which prevented me from talking to her for some while. What seemed strange to me in this story was not that I had fallen for someone, my turn had simply come, but that I had fallen for her in particular, since by my nature I was usually attracted to women with dark skin, as dark as possible, and she was flaxen-haired and pale, almost pallid. And do not be surprised, my friend, if I tell you that although I loved her with passion, her corporality, even from close, did not awaken in me the first thought of desire. What ignited my mysterious feeling of love was only pity. When I saw Wanda, that was her name, weep as she described her life, at her pains at the hands of her stepmother, her father who was Polish and, she gave to understand, a drunk. How she suffered taking constant care of his brood, patching clothes and cleaning stains. And then when I learned they were planning to traffic her, as they had her older sister, I decided, in order to save her, I would leave prejudice aside and lift her to my level. I knew only too well what gossip would follow my actions. The judgments of the living did not concern me, but the dead demanded my explanation. They returned during frigid nights of insomnia, standing in rows like in old Greek icons. Against the red gold background and rigid in their arc caftans, these proud archontes, carrying their decapitated heads, turning their disgusted, unyielding gazes away from me, the traitor. I did not have the strength to resist, and I let myself be cast about by the will of fate. My year of mourning was ending. Only a little more remained before the day we would be engaged. I had even ordered the rings. Then, on the morning I was bringing them, engraved with our names, back from the jeweler, who did I find waiting on the bench by the door? I was still living at Poldo de Pământ, or Kalea Plevne, as the name became. But Cucoana Elenka, wife of the exchequer, one of the most imposing of my mother's neighborhood friends. She had something to tell me. I had a premonition. I invited her in. She wept, briefly, for Cucoana Nikutsa, but as soon as her tears were gone, she vehemently denounced my plans, saying that even were Wanda an honest girl, I would be committing a great sin. But in no case could I proceed with some tartlet who slept with the dregs of society and had already had call for the doctor and the midwife. I was petrified. If you do not believe me, dear boy, she added, keep watch one night after 11. See for yourself how she lets her amaretto in through the window. I can even tell you who it is. Frane, the widow's boy, the painter, the one who plays the harmonium. A stake went through my heart. My ears started to hum and the house spun around me. It was a mortal blow. However calamitous my circumstances seemed, I did not lose my senses. I judged things coolly. The fact that she had made mistakes before I met her, lacking as she did in the attention or upbringing, surrounded by bad examples and bad advice, wounded but did not surprise me. Yet to mock me in this way, with this kind of man, on the eve of our engagement, that exceeded any measure, and I could never forgive her. And I recalled the time I asked my mother to tell my future, and she explained that I would have part of all the happiness life affords, except love.
Thank you very much. This is a fantastic passage. You know, it's wonderful. Any comments, discussion, please? Can I ask one question? I mean, that just, you know, is related to this part. And how much actually? I don't know, Shan. Maybe you have a feeling. How much of Matei do you think it's in here? I mean, you know, in each one of these rakes, I think there is a part of him. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's, you know, we have the sense that each of them is giving us a different facet, and that each of them is composed of multiple facets and multiple characters. You know, all the times in which Pirgu could be seen to stand in for his father, right? The Pirgu as the author of sketches, Skizze. Or, as we already mentioned, I think Luminitz mentioned at the beginning, the letter that he receives, ostensibly from his parents in the plural, sounds like something that his one parent, his father, would write him. So I think, yes, there's Matei in these characters, but yes, there is also other sources for them. The fascinating thing for me over the summer was some research I was doing following up this lead during the long sequence of the fantasy about traveling back to the 18th century, which of course is it's the European 18th century centered on France that's important for Matei. There we have the rakes embodying his fantasy of being part of the 18th century. Where does our best knowledge of the 18th century come from? It comes from Casanova, from the biography of Casanova, the autobiography of Casanova that he writes. It's the most amazing book I've read in some time, and huge too. It goes on for pages and pages. Casanova is also somebody who invents a noble lineage for himself. One that does not exist. He's also somebody of dubious parentage. And there are passages that I hope to publish in a more ample study showing where the descriptions that Casanova gives of himself are lifted and placed in the narrative as descriptions of Pirgu. So I think that this is kind of a roundabout way of saying, you know, how much Matei is there in these characters. There's so much Matei, but it's Matei and other people, and they're all kind of filtered together. And part of the genius of the work is the way that these come to land with a series of powerful impressions upon us.
I learned from Matei Călinescu, from his one of his books, the one that I'm pretty sure you know, the one from Biblioteca Apostrof. I believe there was right after he came back from Berlin, like after 1912, Matei Caragiale hanged out with a lot of strange characters, including one that also had an invented noble lineage. Like I think the name was Alexandru Bogdan Pitești, who was pretty much a crook with a very complicated personal story, and who also was claiming that he's related to the imperial families of the Orient and so on. So he had a lot of examples right before World War I. And as he worked on in the 20s, he worked on his novel. I think he had plenty of models, and somehow he blended them in these characters. It's part himself, and now go ahead and translate that. It's a very difficult task. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
I don't know if I can add. Yeah, sorry.
Just briefly, I think that one way to look at that is to say that it makes the task very difficult. There's also possible the opposite reaction, which is to say that Mate's own practice is so translational that he is also drawing on so many different sources and using these to create his text, that the process of translation possibly finds in him a companion, finds a colleague in his work, as opposed to an antagonist.
Yeah, I wanted to continue. Maybe it's a great question, and how much of Mateo is in different paragraphs of this book. Yeah, it's complicated, of course, because Mateo is a character, or was a character even in the real life. So there was a problem, and because we are speaking about that, I wanted to ask you something. I understood that you, as a translator, you dislike missing jokes, for example, and yeah, you know, there are Romanian professional readers claiming that there is no humor in this novel. What do you think about that? I assume that there is a projection or a confusion between the, I know, Mateo, the real person, and Mateo, the character.
Yeah, I hope they live happy lives and have loving families and are satisfied in other areas of their existence, because they're completely wrong about that aspect of the book. I mean, we can only point to the transformation of Pircu, and as he's walking on the street carrying a selection of Montaigne, which has to be one of the funniest moments of the book, right? That he's like, you know, oh, what's the lines? And like, you know, are parts de Louis, right? Like this, his deprecation and his that
Romanian is drăguț, Montaigne.
Drăguț, yeah, it's drăguț.
A nice one.
Or when Pircu, he comes upon him at the folklore festival, and there's Pircu dancing with a panpipe in his belt, and he's got the national thing. I think this is funny. I see the opening of the book as a parody. I see the opening of the book as a parody of Deșteaptă-te Române, right? So the beginning of the national anthem, which at this point is simply a very well-known poem from 1848, where you are asked to think of, you know, wake up Romanian from the sleep of death and to embrace your proud Latin blood. What happens when the narrator wakes up? He is completely hungover, because his version of Romanianness is not triumphant, but exactly the opposite. He's suffering from a palsy. He can't think of standing up even if his house is on fire. So I think all of these things are moments of humor. I mean, I whether or not I personally dislike missing jokes, I dislike missing all the things that I miss and that I know I miss, even when I'm translating. Especially, I miss things when I miss jokes in T.S. Eliot as well. So that's just the frustration of being mortal, I think. But no, I think that Mate definitely has moments of intense comedy, and we would be doing him a disservice if we didn't find them.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah.
Example one, because I have about 20. Here's Pircu getting with the carriage, and with the curse, he ordered the carriage forward. Come to the funeral tomorrow, he shouted with his head out the side as he moved away. I'm giving a speech. Like, I mean, how serious is the author when he's writing that? I mean, but you have to be a careful reader, and you have to be prepared to understand. This is there's a tone of, I don't know how to describe it, dark sarcasm, which is not typically Romanian. It's Matei himself. He's this dandy. Who's I think his writing was old-fashioned as he landed, you know, in 1929, and that's he's looking for it. Mm-hmm. And from within this language, the humor arises. Yeah. Karina, what do you think? Did I get this right?
Of course, I have in my mind another kind of examples, but they are maybe a bit non-politically correct, but they are great paragraphs in this book, really, and I think. In every paragraph, we will find an irony. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Agree.
Yeah.
Totally.
That's why I asked. Yeah, and even okay, there are maybe some key images. Oh, of course, but there are also paragraphs where the key images are deconstructed. So everything is, yeah. I think we speak about a very intelligent writer, and maybe 10 years. It took 10 years to finish this book.
Yeah, it's a decade.
In 10 years, I think he had the time to think about everything. Yeah.
So
I
I
may
wonder.
have-
Yeah,
Oh.
please.
Thank you. If I may have two questions, I don't know how much they are related with things that were talked about until now. First of all, I mean, this parody to what was to become the national anthem of Romania. I wanted to ask Sean whether he feels or he thinks that this parody, this, let's say, blackly critical attitude to this false patriotism, false patriotic ideas of the time are somehow in some connection with Karadziale father's humor and criticism towards the Romanian realities of another time of 50 years or 70 years before, and whether is this some connection between the son and the father. And the second question, starting from the, how should I put it, very graphic composition of the novel, of those very strong images, colorful, sometimes painfully colorful images and picturesque images of the book. What do you think about the filming of the book, about the equalization made by Mircea Veroiu in 1995? Because it is very, the opinions are, the meanings are very contradictory. Sometimes there are voices which very praise this film, and in the same time there are voices which strongly criticize it. What do you think about it?
So in response to the first question, I would agree. I think that also that there is a room for seeing the connection that maybe Mate is learning from the styles of parody that his father developed. I hesitate to say more because I've read Karadziale Sr. I haven't dealt with him to the same extent that I've dealt with Mate. Regarding the film, I'd be actually very interested to learn more about the critical history, the critical reception of the film. In my opinion, the film did two things for me. One was to give me a pattern for some of the voices. So Pashadia in particular, Pashadia and Perigu in particular, the names of the actors, Adulescu, is that the one? And then
Mircea Albulescu.
Albulescu, yeah. And so that gave me, I watched the film fairly often. It's anytime I felt like I was losing the thread of my translation when working on dialogue, I would go back and listen to some of these scenes. But the other thing that happens in the film is, of course, that, there's the narrator gets a name. There are passages taken from one sequence in the book, and they're replaced in a different passage. Possibly they're taken from a line of dialogue and made into a line of description, or vice versa. There are things that are out of sequence from the book that reveal kind of a transformative approach towards retelling the story from the novel. Those things were also important to me because I felt that they gave me a kind of license, again, to follow my being globally faithful while locally unfaithful approach. I felt that the film did the same thing. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Doru, how do you view this, please? I wanted to.
I would like to bring in one important aspect in understanding Matei's role in Romanian literature, and that is the fact that he was published by Gândirea in starting 1926, and Gândirea was one of the right-wing to say the least, journals, creating an atmosphere which allowed the development of Romanian fascism. He was a good friend with Noica, a good friend with Eliade, who were hardcore fascists at that time. So that being said, it has to, I mean, we have to understand from which perspective Gândira, at that time, the manager of Gândira was Nikifor Crainic, another ideologist of Romanian fascism. And again, the question is, why would they publish pieces of this novel, and how did they perceive it at that time, and why they believed it suited the intellectual atmosphere of Gândira? And here is the paradox with Matei and with Crai de Curte Veche, because on one hand, he builds up this very veridic, very realistic world of Romania that is certainly placed in Bucharest in a mahala world, in the with drunkards and with people singing and acting in a way that it appears to be valued. But on the other hand, Matei is a strong critic of modernity and the impact of modernity on Romania, and his criticism of society has to be understood in the context in which that generation was criticizing the effects of French Revolution, the effects of democracy, the bad influences from the West into our society. Now, making this, I think, important context, the problem with the film is that it projects into reality a work which is profoundly symbolical, a work which has ambiguousness at so many levels that it's oftentimes very hard to decipher, and it was hard to decipher in that time, and which makes it immortal in a way. I mean, this is the legacy that, fortunately for him, Matei died in 1936, so we don't know what his political future would have been, but clearly, I mean, my criticism of the film, it was criticized on many levels. For example, the projections in historical projections, when we see the fantastic dreams and the historical encounters are pathetic representations, almost comedic representations, where they are not. In the same time, the entire development of this world with prostitutes and again, in a very vulgarized, very vulgar way, creating or reconstructing a pseudo Bucharest. While with the book itself, I think it's great how it glides from past to present, from reality to fantasy, from what is true and what is not true, from, again, multiple layers that he plays with. And another thing that I found distasteful in the movie is not only the vulgarity of it and the projection of this nobility of Bucharest, this past nobility that seems to be desirable, which clearly is not for Matei, because he's criticizing it and he's almost demonizing it, is the fact that Veroiu was not able to construct the true atmosphere of the novel, which it was noted by many literary critics, is that these are nocturnal pieces. I mean, this is almost like a nightmarish dream. It creates this atmosphere of a nightmare, of a funny nightmare, of sometimes sarcastic nightmare, but still a nightmare. While for me, the movie it is just this superficial projection of real scenes, as if Matei was describing real activities. So I will stop here. Maybe we can continue along these lines or other lines if you like.
Is part of your criticism of the movie then that a particular reality that it's not representing is the right-wing reality or the right-wing vision of the world that was the original context of the novel?
No. I was saying that the movie is trying to create a realistic representation of a society that doesn't exist. In fact, Matei's society, which some people think it's real, it's actually a satire, a criticism of an anti-modernist writer. He profoundly despised Romanian modern society. That's my reading, at least. He was an anti-modernist fundamentally because he belonged to an anti-modernist movement. He was writing in Gândirea, and he was accepted by those ideologies. I'm not blaming him for anything. I'm just trying to contextualize. I mean, he's still a great writer, and again, as I said, it influenced my own small contributions to literature. But again, if we take him as a realist writer, and the entire descriptions that he's making there with the interactions between the rakes, as you call them, are not that realistic. I mean, he is creating a dark, sarcastic projection of society that it doesn't exist. And Veroiu is using with Albulescu and of course with Ovidiu Iuliu Moldovan, he's reconstructing this aristocratic Bucharest of the 1910s, perhaps, or the 20s, that actually doesn't exist, and that I believe Matei was criticizing. He profoundly despised what was happening to Romania at that time. That's my view. So the film is so superficial and so blatantly realistic without any depth. I mean, it's like it's not even a costume drama. It never reaches at least that level. It could have been a decent costume drama. So for me, the movie is a failure.
I completely agree. On the one hand, we have to come from the truth, from the hypothesis that actually Mircea Veroiu, as a person, as an intellectual, he was a left-wing intellectual, and he was used to making a certain kind of films during socialism, during the communist era. It was a kind of shablon, it was a kind of déjà vu, a kind of scheme he was more or less used to do. And he wasn't able to see in this novel something more than the practical, realistic description of a society, which is what he put on the screen, without analyzing the symbolic, the metaphoric depth of all those images, all those metaphors. This is one aspect. On the other hand, we have to understand that Mircea Veroiu was used to make films according to communist schemes. That means according to some scheme given from above, to which he only had to create a story around. This was already 96, and the reality was changed. He wasn't able to adapt to this new Romanian reality. And the third aspect, not so well known, is that actually this movie, this adaptation, was meant to be done by Liviu Ciulei, which didn't happen because Liviu Ciulei was at that time already too old. If I'm not wrong, maybe he was already dead. I'm not sure. So therefore, Mircea Veroiu took the initial ideas of Liviu Ciulei and tried to connect them to his style of making films, which was actual maybe 20 years ago, 20 years before, in the 70s. So in short, unfortunately, a failure, which could have been an excellent movie, one of the best ever made in the very difficult period of the 90s.
And actually, Ciulei died in 2011, so he was still alive in '96.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
But the problem, once again, I think the biggest problem is generally with the Romanian cinema, and I extensively wrote about it. There is this drive for realism in our cinema, a strong drive for realism, which was practiced before 1989 and is still practiced today. While other cinemas around us, like for example contemporary Hungarian cinema, are moving towards more surrealistic, a more fantastic approach to cinematic devices. And I think Mateu and Crai de Curte Veche, the rakes, to use Sean's term, which I like. I don't dislike Sean. When I was asking why you chose it, I was just curious to know. I think it's a fantastic option. But Crai and the rakes are extremely well suited for a fantastic surrealistic approach, and that would be extraordinary to have somebody to adapt this wonderful novel, this very strange and sophisticated work, placed in its intent, in its designed function, that is, and it has to be coupled with the fascination of other contemporary writers. For example, Mircea Eliade, his friend and contemporary, a great fascist at that time, and still maybe, he also was fascinated with fantasy. Many of his novels, like La Țigănci or Noaptea de Sânziene, are fantastic projections in which he uses the fantastic to deal with contemporary issues. And I think Matei was doing the same. He was projecting a dark fantasy to deal with the problems of his current time. So again, who knows? Maybe at some point we will have a fantastic realist movie that would do justice to Matei's novel.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. Please, Sean.
Oh no, I was just going to chime in to offer my thanks as well. I asked for information. I asked to learn something about the critical reception of the movie, and I did. And you won't get any argument from me about the nature of Gândirea or the position of Noica and Eliade and Cioran in these same circumstances, in the same right-wing context. I think that there might be room for making a distinction between Matei and somebody and these other more convinced fascists that you're talking about. I think that they do all trade on this idea of Romania in crisis, right? That what some have called their passion for Romania is built upon the idea that Romania needs transfiguration. Right? I think that in that respect, they do look. Some of these other writers do look forward towards a transformed Romania that has the population of China and the destiny of France, to quote Cioran. Right? I don't think that we can put Matei in the same category. And I think that there are, I think that Gândirea has many authors that are on various positions on this ideological spectrum, and that their presence in Gândirea can show possibly a reception, and there's aspects of the work that contribute to the positive reception by people further to the right than they are, but it doesn't automatically make them into fascists or proto-fascists. Blaga, for example. The idea that we are spared in the same way that Pashadia is spared. We are spared witness to Matei's evolution over the 1930s and 1940s. It could be that he would have disappointed us or surprised us. But the idea that we would build something in the same way that we would build something on Eliade's work, for example, that we would build a new Romania, or that we would, have something like what we get in Eliade's story, Un Om Mare, that we could ever have this kind of birth of a leader coming out of the context of Mate, I think is really difficult to believe. That's the small specification that I would make, that in his case, yes, he puts Romania in the center of his novel. Yes, he does it with a sense of diagnosing problems of the novel. But no, I don't think you can actually build anything. There's no positive value for the Romanianness that he talks about that can be transformed by the appearance of a great leader. Right. I think that aspect is important for contextualizing the right-wing ideologies of these other writers, and it's not found in Mate. I think in Mate you have simply decadence leading to decadence, built upon decadence. Right? So I'm also interested to learn about the film. I have to admit, I was at first surprised and mystified by your reactions to it being too realistic. Once I understand both of you putting it in the context of communist era films, then of course, yes, I see what you're saying. That those in that terms, that definition of realism, there is, I can see it part of that lineage. I have to admit that lineage was lost on me. But I did when I first started watching the movie. I think I first watched it at Cinemateca Eforie in 1995, and had no idea about that. And so to me, the film actually seemed much stranger. To my, and I'm saying this by admitting my lack of historical depth at that moment. That to me it seemed, I thought nobody talks like this as they do in the movie. Nobody walks like that. The pace, the gait of the actors in the movie is so slow and so kind of hypnotized, and often comes in sync with the other actors. For me, that violates the realism of the movie and makes me. I never once believed that this was supposed to be anything more than a prolonged, intoxicated, linguistically intoxicated dream. So I think that. Part of it, maybe my more naive reaction could be revisited in light of the history you're talking about. But there's also, I think, room there as we're thinking about the international circulation of modernist texts, to think about how strange that movie seems when you're seeing it outside of the left-wing context. Yeah. So those are my two reactions to very welcome interventions.
An interesting aspect is that it was a Hungarian director, József Paczkowski, which is considered to be the initiator of the so-called first wave among the three Hungarian young waves at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, which had a project which really wanted to adapt the rakes of the old cart into a movie. Well, until the end, he abandoned this plan because he found no financiation, no financial means for making it. But he was very fascinated by this story. So actually, this is confirming the attraction of some surrealist directors, which he used to be at that time, for stories like the one written by Matteo Caragiale. And I really think that if this project would have been made until the end, it would have been a great movie, at least judging according to the movies Paczkowski made so far.
So our original estimate for the event was around 90 minutes, and I believe we slightly exceeded it. And I was wondering if if we're getting ready to wrap it up, if perhaps Luminica and Alex, you would like to add up something for the end, any thoughts you might have, please.
I'd have a very practical question for Professor Coulter. When will you publish the studies, the critical studies on Crai de Curtea Veche? Because I've heard some very interesting reflections here on the multi-layered geographical, linguistic, literary structures of this piece of work, and I'm looking forward to reading those studies. I must say, in addition, that I'm not a great fan of the literary studies, the Romanian literary studies we have on Matei Caragiale up to now. Some of them are lost in, I don't know, heraldic details and so other kinds of phenomena that Matei Caragiale deals with, but his work is a superior melting of that, and I believe that a lot of literary critics have gone in the wrong direction by emphasizing all those. I'm not sure what to call them. All those occultist details. So I think there's a great need for more rational deciphering, decoding of Matei Caragiale's work.
There's no greater incentive than knowing that you'll have good readers at the other end of a publication. I've been working on this material for some time. I gave presentations at Princeton and at Yash, and had very good reactions, very kind of good discussions like the one we're having today about the work. I share your opinion about the vast majority of scholarship on the work. If it's any consolation, the same thing happens with Joyce, and the same thing happens with Eliot, the same thing happens with Bound, the same thing happens with Wolf. There's a kind of veneration or idolatry that leads towards the investigation of kind of minute details that leave the bigger questions unfinished. So far, I've been able to incorporate some of the things that I've been talking about today in the introduction and in the notes to the book. So I was pleased that I had that opportunity there, but I'm far from done with talking about Matei.
Thank you. Please, Luminița.
Yeah, I wanted to add something regarding the relationship between Gândirea, and I agree with Mr. Cotter that I think we shouldn't overestimate this thing. I think we should bear in mind that as fascist as they may have been, those people from Gândirea, they knew what literature is. They knew what good literature is, and I think we also should have in mind that the entire artistic dynasty of Caragiale, starting with the great uncle Costache Caragiale, the father Ioan Luca Caragiale, they all have this. They were all interested in the social parody in their plays and in their prose. Let's take O Noapte Furtunoasă, Stormy Night, who was criticized as being immoral. Seeing a piece of art, a play or a text as a factual, realistic depiction of something, of a country, or as a parody, I think it is in the eye of the reader. So I think that thing about Gândirea is not something that really defines Matei. This is what I wanted to add, and for Mr. Cotter, really congratulations. When I first had the PDF in front of me, what I wanted to know was, how does this sound? Usually with two various variants of a text, I had the vice versa experience. When I was in high school, let's say I read French literature in French, and then years later, when I had in my hands the one book of Flaubert or Saint-Exupéry, I was like, what is this? This is not Flaubert. Well, when I had the Rex of the Old Court and I read it, I was like, well, this sounds like Matei Caragiale. And this is really, I think this is exceptional because it is not something easy to do.
Thank you very much. Your appreciation means a lot to me. It's wonderful. I think you're right in general that the Gândirea group is, we don't want to simply have the kind of the mark of fascism on all the writers that are associated with that. There's in the American context, there might be an important role for mentioning that aspect of his reception, because would be too easy, I think, for some, let's say, overly supportive American readers to see in the linguistic tensions at the center of Matei's work an endorsement of a kind of a postmodern polyvocality. In other words, they can make him into a champion for diversity, which I don't think is in there. Right? I think that the work is centered on the crisis of Romania. It's not centered. It doesn't, it doesn't support other voices in that way. Those other voices are there as part of the diagnosis of a problem. So I think it's important for American readers not to like it too much in that sense. And so I think there is an important role for the historical context in that aspect.
And just a quick note here. Please reread the passages in which he describes Rashelika Nachmanson and the Jewish prototype of the prostitute, who is a bisexual, thieving, conniving character. And that is not non-ideological. That is deeply imbued with the vision of the context. We clearly cannot read it in a realistic fashion, because if we do that, then the novel, the prose, loses its qualities. In the same time, we do need to understand that context, because it's a very, very strange moment. When Matei was writing in Gândirea was not yet moving towards its hardcore dimension of Krajnik's orthodoxism and clear fascism. But again, we need to understand the entire atmosphere in post-World War I Romania, which in a way, Matei manages to create a portrait, a dark portrait, a very dark portrait of that society. So we need to understand that portrait in its darkness, in its deep darkness, to understand the value of that work. I believe that's my own reading of the text. So I never said that he was a fascist, and I never said that Gândirea is totally a fascist magazine.
I think you're absolutely right to point to the anti-Semitism in the portrait of Rashelika. I think we have to pair that with the fact that there's an anti-Christian sentiment in the character's desire for Rashelika. That both sides of this are intertwined in Matei's description of this. And yes, she is bisexual, but so is Pashadia, right? That he knows all the songs that Poponel knows. So if we take her character in isolation, there is a clear connection with the broader the incredibly strong and broad swaths of anti-Semitism in Romania. But we shouldn't take it in isolation as an anti-Semitic passage. We should see that as part of the entire corruption of this very, I think you're accurate to say, dark picture of Romania.
Wow, I mean, it would be really interesting if we start the conversation right now and it would take like 4 more hours.
It's true.
So, thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much, Lumenica. Thank you, Crina. Thank you, Doru, and thank you, Alex. Really appreciate it. Let me turn the floor now to Mircea Danduță, who's going to tell us more about the Familia series, and he's going to remind us what the next events are. Please.
First of all, thank you very much for this really special edition of Familia's International Reunions, which actually takes further our initial intention of promoting Romanian authors for being translated into foreign languages and being published in foreign countries, enriching this initial intention with presenting great opuses of the Romanian literature, which have already been translated and published, which is the case of the Greeks of the Old Court. It is a dimension which I intend to amplify in the future, so that we would dedicate also other editions of the reunions to great authors, to great works of the Romanian literature translated and published in other countries, alternating this with the promotion of the living Romanian authors for being translated. Next week we will have also a special edition of the literary salons dedicated entirely to the performing poetry. We will have 4 performing poets from Poland, from Czech Republic, from Romania, and most probably from Ukraine. Each of them is going to have at one's disposal 30 minutes. So it will be not only literature, but also performance. And we also have to reschedule the missed episode with Romanian authors being promoted on the Hungarian literary market, which we weren't able to transmit because of technical reasons. We expect this to happen at the end of August or at the beginning of September. We kindly and warmly invite you to take part to all those transmissions. That means international reunions or literary salons, which are meant to be to intermediate contacts between Romanian and foreign contemporary authors. Once again, warm and respectful thanks to all our guests. Thank you very much, Sean Carter, for being here with us. Thank you very much, Bogdan Suceava, for initiating, for coming with this wonderful idea and for organizing this special edition of the international reunions. Thank you very much, all of our respected and dear guests, Mrs. Lumenica Corneanu, Mrs. Crina Bud, Mr. Doru Pop, Mr. Alex Goldish, and last but not least, Mircea Picăjan, the coordinator under the auspices of the Familia Literary Magazine of all those programs. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, and we are looking forward to the issue of this study about Rakes of the Old Court in the translation of Sean Carter. All the best. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.